Hi, everyone. So thank you so much for coming. If you're in person or if you're online, it means so much to me. This is a project I've been working on for the past year academically, but has really informed my work for quite a while now. I should learn to talk into the microphone. Um, and uh, and honestly, we have much more to come going forward. This is really kind of a kickoff for much more to come. If you may notice that we have a couple, if you're in person, we have a couple documentary cameras filming. I'll let you extrapolate from that what you will. And yeah, so my name is Tim Rattray, by the way, if you don't know. Again, I'm moderating this panel, and these are fantastic panelists. We'll be talking to them in 1 second, but I want to go through a few just kind of, housekeeping first. So first, if you are in person or online, we will be taking your questions. So anyone here in person, when it comes time for Q&A, we will just raise hands and I will come out to you. And if you're online, we will be taking as many of your questions as we can. Also, I will get to this after the panel, as well as special thanks at that time. But we will have a networking event after the panel at a bar that is about a half mile from here, so it's a little bit of a walk. But I hope as many of you can make it as possible. Everybody's invited. So with that said, I kind of want to start off today by talking about something you probably didn't come here to talk about, which is film. Now, why am I talking about film? The thing is, film has been an incredibly poignant medium to talk about many social topics, to get across ideas of physical and mental health. And largely the reason for this is because film requires a director to have a vision, and that vision can allow them to direct exactly what the audience is seeing at all times. So they're in charge of not in charge of, but they have control over the editing, the acting decisions, the writing, what ends up on the screen, what have you. In a game, things are a little bit different because the player becomes the camera, the player becomes the director, and in this moment, the entire perspective shifts of how they're engaging with the content. Now, for something like mental illness, which is an internal struggle, the amazing thing is that, or perhaps not so amazing, I should say, is that it's very difficult for people to understand exactly what mental illness feels like if they haven't dealt with it. And this is very understandable. At the same time, we really need to find better ways for mental health advocacy. And the reason why games are fantastic for this is because through being able to play from the perspective of another character who may be dealing with, or in our case, is dealing with the internal struggle of mental illness, and who is able to make choices, have player agency over the story that they are a part of and the world they are a part of. You really get the chance to give people an experience as close to the lived reality as possible, something that film doesn't offer. So film, fantastic in many ways. This is not to downplay film in any capacity, but the interactive element, I feel, is the way forward for mental health advocacy. So with that, I want to get to our panelists. Thank you so much again for coming, and let's go. All right, so first, let me introduce our panelists. We have Sam Barlow, we have Sarah Doherty Granoff, and we have Dr. Manoj Pardasani. Each of them are going to just go for a minute or two and just talk about their work and what they do and why they're here. So, yeah. Sam, you want to start
go first?
Yeah.
So I've been making video games for 20-something years, and in particular, as a writer and director of video games, I've been particularly interested in telling stories that deal with people's interiority. It was interesting you talked about film, because I think often the thing people talk about with film is that because it's this visual medium and you have the camera, that you should tell stories that deal with people's external reality, whereas a novel, for example, is much more suitable for dealing with people's inner monologues and more psychological things. I could debate that, but I think I've been particularly interested in creating video games that are more novelistic in how they deal with narrative and story and character. Most relevant here, I made a game called Silent Hill Shattered Memories, which, this is a spoiler, but it's quite an old game, deals with a young woman who's suffering from complicated grief over the loss of a parent, and across the course of the game, you kind of deal with that. And then the last 3 games I've made have all been novel uses of filmed footage, starting with Her Story, through a game called Telling Lies, and most recently Immortality. And I would say all 3 of those have attempted to deal with types of trauma and put you into places that are more novelistic and give you an intimacy with the characters that is not kind of common in video games.
Yeah, and I just want to add about the FMV style games, Immortality, Her Story, Telling Lies, is that I think when I talk about the strengths of film, you're able to leverage both actually, because you're able to speak to an audience who understands film perhaps, while also having them interact with those film clips in new ways. So I think maybe we'll get to this later, but I think that's a really interesting approach. So anyway. Great stuff, by the way. Everybody play Immortality. It's fantastic. So, Sarah, what about you?
Hello, everyone. My name is Sarah. I have been in the games industry for a much shorter time than Sam. I am a current senior at NYU's Game Center, set to graduate in May. I am also, thank you, I am also autistic and have made a number of games that are very autobiographical about that experience being autistic. I've made a couple of games. One of them is called ASD, just Autism Spectrum Disorder, which is a roguelike about trying to navigate New York City on sort of a very busy day. One called Conversations on the Spectrum, which I can sort of describe as the Five Nights at Freddy's of conversation simulators. Mm-hmm. Another one called Mask, which I made as part of a cross-cultural impact jam with an international team of students that was about the autistic experience of masking. And another one called Morning Ritual, which was probably my most metaphorical game, but all about sort of how difficult and complicated it can feel to do very simple tasks on bad days.
Yeah, and as we'll also get to as well, I think you have a lot to say about how one can see themselves through games, even when developers may not intend it. So, yeah, and again, really glad to have you, and your games are really cool. I think you really do capture an experience that even for me going into them, I learned a lot. So yeah. And finally, Dr. Manoj Pardasani, go ahead.
Just Manoj, but hi
Manoj.
everyone,
Oh,
just
sorry.
Manoj. My name's Manoj Pardasani, and I'm a provost here at Hunter College. But prior to this life, I trained as a mental health clinician and specialist, so I worked many years in the field of mental health across the age life course. And so through that experience, doing traditional therapy and assessment and diagnosis and treatment, but learning that there are other ways to incorporate technology and how that improves access, reduces stigma, gets people to seek help or even think about seeking help, sort of got more interested in that arena. And then some years ago, working with older adults and mental health, I was part of a group that developed this game called Age-tastic, which is really about increasing awareness and knowledge about mental health, physical health, sort of holistically, and then testing it out with seniors all across New York City. And so that sort of sparked my interest in games and how does it affect mental health and how can we use it, as you both have done in your work so effectively. And so that's sort of my area of interest. And I want to apologize in advance. I have to leave about 10 minutes early. Not right now, but I don't mean to be rude. I have to go speak at another event. Sorry.
Yeah, I think something also that's really interesting about your research on Age-tastic and the actual impact it's had is that it really has shows a direct correlation between playing this game and an increase in mental health awareness amongst older adults. So actually, I want to get to you first to kind of just get an idea of where we're at the landscape of mental health awareness, mental health advocacy. Maybe best way to go about it is to ask, what are the current challenges we're facing?
Okay.
This is a big question. A big question.
Mental health has always been a focus, right? Like, people have struggled with mental health issues through millennium. But today, as we stand now, there's greater awareness of what mental health constitutes. What are some of the challenges people face? What are the commonly diagnosed disorders? In some ways, it's a good thing because more and more people are becoming aware. On the other hand, sometimes you wonder if it's sort of the commercialization of health and more people just, get diagnosed because they need to get diagnosed in order to get treated. So it's sort of a conundrum. But the good thing is that we know more about mental health and mental illness, addictions today, even spectrum disorders, developmental disabilities, than we did ever before, because the research has evolved in advance and we have better ways and better tools to treat those disorders and illnesses or conditions. The challenge is there's still a stigma in our society towards mental health issues, mental illness, disorders, other developmental disorders. People feel like it's a label, and it's true because then I've had clients when I was a therapist walk in and say, "Hi, my name is Bob, I'm bipolar Bob." I'm like, what? No, you're just Bob, right? No, bipolar disorder is a condition you've been diagnosed with. That's not your identity. And so sometimes it becomes very difficult for people to seek help. And sometimes overwhelming, like, where do you start? Who do you talk to? Are you going to be labeled? Is there going to be shame? And so I think that what we need to do better, I think some of the challenges today is one of them is sort of reducing the stigma. That it's just a condition, just like you have diabetes or just like you have chronic pain, you seek help. It's just the same. It's not worse, it's not better, it's all the same. And it's a human condition. So I think that's part of it. The other part is really how do we make people aware of what resources and supports are out there? How do we increase people's awareness and knowledge? Sometimes people feel things and go through certain experiences, but they don't know what that is and what they're going through and what it means. And are they all by themselves and alone, or other people feeling the same way? And where do you start? So I think that the next step is increasing that awareness to issues about mental health. And how can we do that? If I just put up a sign outside my door and said, "Come, let's talk about depression or dementia," how many people will walk in that door, right? Because some might, but others are like, wait, does this apply to me? So I think somehow we have to get the information and how people consume information today, and I'll end with that. I think the challenge today is how people receive and consume information. Generationally, some people receive it through reading about it, in newspapers or magazines. Some people like to watch it on TV or, Google stuff. And then others, I think especially the younger generation, consume social media, right, and games. And so is there a way to utilize technology like games, like AI, to build this awareness, to have access to people who otherwise would not know about this, and sort of just democratize the field? Like, here's all that there is. Now you could seek help in multiple ways.
Yeah, and I find that actually very interesting when you note that it is a younger crowd that plays games. I think as we grow older, more and more generations are gaming generations. But actually, Sarah, something I found really interesting when actually we had talked in the past is that you had an anecdote about a mother who played one of your games. I believe it was Conversations on the Spectrum, but I could be incorrect on that. I'll let you fill in the details. But she had an experience that really opened her eyes.
Yes, so the game in question was ASD, actually, and it was the roguelike that I had made. And I believe that it was at Playcrafting 2017, I want to say, though I could be wrong about that. But she played this game, and after she had played it, she had sort of the typical roguelike experience of failing and failing and failing and failing and then finally succeeding. She told me that her daughter was also on the spectrum, actually, and that playing this game had sort of helped her to understand a bit better, like, oh, this is what my daughter goes through. Like, that's why this is really hard for her, because, yeah, this game is really hard. And that it did give her some insight kind of into what that experience would be like.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because, you know, my father, who happens to be in the audience here, actually had a very similar experience when he played Depression Quest for the first time, and that really helped him understand what I was dealing with. So I think having maybe the younger generation introduce the older generation to these games that directly, approach these topics is really maybe a major way forward. Like, maybe it is on, would you even say in any way that you feel that is on the younger generation to kind of make that move?
I think that can certainly be part of it. I do also think that gaming itself is generally a far broader pastime in terms of who is doing it than people seem to, I guess, think or recognize. There is a whole segment of people who wouldn't necessarily call themselves gamers, but who do play some form of game every single day. Be it that they do the crossword puzzle every day, be it that they play Candy Crush on the subway. You know, there are legions of people who don't consider themselves gamers, but who do game. So I think that part of it is kind of finding ways to reach that audience. And then, yes, part of it may be on kind of the younger generation who is more plugged into kind of these narrative games and do think of themselves more as being gamers, to maybe make those bridges to their parents of, hey, I know that you like to play the crossword, or you like doing puzzle games. Here's this really cool puzzle game that, also talks about this.
Yeah, definitely. And also, I will say, Sam, we'd had a little bit of back and forth already about how you use film in your games. Have you seen that impact the type of audience you're reaching, and maybe even whether it's about mental health or not, the way they're thinking about games?
Yeah, I think that when I did Her Story, which was the first of these games with live action, that was like a low-level assumption that this will make this accessible in a way that other stuff wouldn't be. But I think more generally, it was a much broader thing. It was particularly phones, right? Like the prevalence of phones means that 90% of the people walking down the street have a high-powered gaming device in their pocket that they can use somewhat expertly. So with the game design of Her Story, knowing that it was this thing that could live on a phone, and if people understood how to Google, they could kind of get their heads around it, I think that was as useful. I think the thing with live action is when you're dealing with emotion and the interiority of characters, you instantly get access to that when you have character performances, which, and I'd been, prior to Her Story, I'd been working in kind of AAA adjacent stuff, where in that world I was like, well, look at these graphics, they're so lifelike. Like, this just looks like a real person. And then you step outside of that world for a couple of years and you're like, actually, no, it doesn't. Like, it's still, there is still a way to go. So I think that to me was, and obviously when you have live action and performance, then you bring in so much more with the collaboration as well.
Yeah, actually, you bring up something interesting there that I'm curious to get your ear on, which is, you have worked in the AAA space with a lot of your other producers and, whatnot. How have you seen them react to any concepts about mental illness in your games? And I know, you specifically, again, Silent Hill Shattered Memories is very specifically about the psychologically profiling the player, so I'm sure it came up within that capacity.
I mean, I think I probably have a skewed view now, but so that was 2009 that game came out, and I think at that point in gaming, there was not a huge amount of awareness. And even the expectations of what subjects you could talk about in a video game was very limited. So we had a kind of get out of jail free card that we were using the Silent Hill IP, which at that time, if you were doing a horror game, and specifically kind of the psychological horror of Silent Hill, it was the only way anyone was going to let you make a game that wasn't just fun. Like any other genre of game, the assumption was this is a thing people are playing to have fun, to feel empowered. It's going to be kind of popcorn. But the people that were funding it were like, damn it, I guess you get to go and talk to people about grief and make this thing that is trying to tell a nuanced human story because it's this particular genre. And that, and you didn't have the requirement that it had to be fun constantly. You could actually make people feel sad or be bored or think deeper about things. And I think it's clearly it's changed over the last few years, and I think indie gaming that I'm now essentially part of has been a big part of that. I think like Depression Quest was obviously a big kind of poster child for putting something front and center like that. But and especially because a lot of indie games are made by individuals who are attempting to communicate something more specific or more personal to them.
Yeah, definitely. That is really interesting to hear that back then. It sounds like almost, is what you're saying that like they were more open to it back then, maybe out of some level of negligence about what they were actually getting?
I think it's begrudging. I think if it hadn't had the word Silent Hill printed on it, then we'd have been told to put more guns in it and make it more exciting.
That definitely makes sense. I mean, and it's interesting you say exciting because Dr. Pardasani and Manoj, have to get over the what I'm used to, Manoj. So, you actually played a VR game about schizophrenia, which I'm actually not too much in the loop on. So I'd love to hear about your experience, but that's an experience that probably was not necessarily meant to be fun. It was more meant to be something that you experienced a more. I'll let you talk about it.
Yep. So another sort of purpose for games with mental health, mental illness, is really to help other people, friends, family members, other care providers understand what this internal experience is. Like you were saying, it's the internal being externalized. So, for example, in schizophrenia and psychotic disorders, the person is experiencing internally hallucinations, they have delusions that to them is reality, and they're talking about it, but you don't see it. So they believe, for example, that there are two other people that they're having a conversation with, but you're like, who are you talking to? But for that person, it's real. It's not like they're making it up or imagining it. If for them it is real, it feels real. So for family members then, or care providers, they have no idea. So a VR game that really sort of explained what psychosis is, really walked people, it's available on YouTube, but really helped people understand what's the internal experience, how do people struggle. And it shows that when a person is in a psychotic episode, everything appears pretty scary and sort of threatening. And so then when a person may or may not become violent, it's not because it's against you, it's what they're seeing, thinking, or believing that is their reality. So it really helps people understand that. I worked with people with schizophrenia and other serious disorders, and you'd be sitting with a client and they're telling you that they smell fire, and there is no fire, but they believe that something's on fire and they may hurt themselves as a result. So it really helps you understand the experience. The other area where I've seen sort of games being used more and more is in the study of sort of dementia. And more people are diagnosed with dementia. The older we live, the occurrence of dementia increases significantly. We've got millions of people in the United States and around the world who are diagnosed with dementia. And it's not a curable disorder. It's not a treatable disorder. It's a degenerative disorder. It only gets worse over time, but people can live for years and years and they need help. And so what does a person experience when they're in the initial stages of dementia versus the middle stages of dementia versus the final stages? And it really walks you through this process of experiencing it so you can be a better caregiver, a care provider, a better therapist, a better doctor. It really makes you empathic because now you have the lived experience of somebody that you're trying to help but don't know how to.
And actually, that brings me to something else I want to talk to you about, which is, I know when we had spoken before, I think the most insightful thing I felt in our conversation was when you were talking about how certain illnesses like cancer and others that people understand a fatal element of are much easier to express because people might know somebody who's lived with, let's just say, cancer, who is diagnosed with it themselves maybe, but they understand that it is fatal, and therefore there's an easier path to empathy, even if they may not be dealing with it themselves. So I'm curious what you have to say about that when it comes to mental illness, because obviously that is a much more internal thing, as I kind of was talking about in my introduction. So I think that it's much more difficult because you can't really necessarily expect people who are neurotypical to understand exactly what goes through somebody's head. So yeah.
So I think what we were talking about, and correct me, but when it comes to physical illnesses, if you're HIV positive or you have cancer, there's a test. There's an MRI, there's an X-ray, there's a blood test that shows something, and then you get diagnosed, right? So it almost external, like, okay, this is the proof that I am ill with this or this. If you were COVID positive, there's a test to show you're COVID positive, right? But when it comes to mental illness, there's no test per se. There's no definitive test that says, I mean, there are lots of like sort of verbal tests you can take that shows that you're at high risk of depression or anxiety, but it's not a definitive, there's no blood test or urine test that says, sure, these 3 people tested positive for anxiety. And all those, if 3 people had anxiety, they all experience it differently. And their symptoms may be quite different from each other. So it makes it more challenging, and that's why just raising awareness, because somebody may never have seen someone, that experiences what they've experienced or look like what they're going through. And so I think it's more challenging, and so people then become more internalized. They rather not seek help. Like, who do you talk to? What do you say? What is the experience of one person with autism spectrum disorder versus another? And so, the idea of games or something that people can do in the privacy of their space sort of makes it more personal, but also accessible. And they begin to understand, oh yeah, these are some of the issues that I'm facing. This is what it might be. So I think that's where games or technology become more helpful.
Yeah, and you actually use a word there that I find really interesting, which is challenge, because something that I find really interesting about Sarah's games, as well as games, other games about mental illness like Celeste, is that they use challenge as a means of telling their story about depression. So however you want to speak to that, Sarah.
Sure. So I will say that with my kind of autobiographical games about autism, they generally have been pretty challenging for people to play, and that has sometimes been more of an intentional design feature than others. With the first of these autobiographical games that I made, ASD, it was back when I was doing a kind of non-degree game design program at the New York Film Academy, and it was for an assignment where we had to make a roguelike. It was my first time even really hearing that term. The teachers kind of laid out the basics of what a roguelike was. It was procedurally generated. It was incredibly difficult. The gameplay experience was one of repeated failure until finally you figured it out and succeeded. And I'm not even joking when I say that my first thought on hearing that was, oh, so that's just my life. And that was where the inspiration came. So that one was deliberately designed to be difficult. Conversations on the Spectrum, on the other hand, was for a different assignment where we had 24 hours to make an autobiographical game. And I decided that I would make one about the experience of, my experience of having conversations and essentially the mental checklist that I need to run through during them. Things like, am I maintaining the right level of eye contact? Not too much, not too little. What's my current volume? Am I on the right topic of conversation? Have I said too much? Have I said too little? And, I kind of took inspiration from Five Nights at Freddy's for that kind of like managing multiple things. And I was honestly really surprised with how difficult my classmates were finding it to play. And then surprised, though not necessarily unhappy. And then I realized a couple of things. First of all, I made the game, so of course I know, all of the little things that I hadn't had time to bug test out, like all the little ways you could cheat it. But I also realized, I don't find this as difficult because this is just my life. This is something that I'm used to having to do, where my classmates are not. And with the other games that I've made, I would say that I have leaned more into them being difficult, or at the very least kind of tricky, where there is an element of difficulty or complication to them. And that's mostly just because oftentimes the specific experiences that I'm portraying in these games are difficult situations. It's navigating New York City on an incredibly stressful day, and so everything about New York City that is wonderful is also incredibly taxing on the senses. So yeah.
Yeah, I actually kind of just want to add a little bit of just my own stuff to that, because I think one of the most interesting things you can do to kind of ground anybody with anything, but something that I've seen with a lot of games that approach mental illness. I know What Remains of Edith Finch, there's a sequence in that game that does this, where they really bring in the socioeconomic factors of the character. Depression Quest does this as well, to really ground the viewer in something that they will, already have an emotional connection with. So that when you bring in those other elements, there's already an understanding. Speaking of, this is maybe a little bit of a left turn, and Sam, you're gonna have to help me a little bit with this one. Right. But I do think it's not that much of a left turn, though, because I think what Sarah's talking about a lot is creating games about her own experience. And I know in a recent interview you talked about how there was a sequence in Silent Hill: Shattered Memories involving baboons in Tanzania in your life. So I'll let you speak to it. But I'm curious about. Ultimately, I'd love to hear the anecdote, and then what I'm curious about, in particular, is do you think that's a kind of experience that could be harnessed by developers, or should be harnessed by developers in making their games, or not?
Okay, so the story. Yeah, so you jump to the ending. Is so when we made Silent Hill: Shattered Memories, a big feature of that game, which was a horror game, was it was one of the first games where you didn't whack enemies with crowbars and shoot them and stuff. You ran away from them, which, as a horror fan, I was like, this is the primary kind of action beat of most horror media, is you run away from the thing. And there was a particular area that involved a swimming pool that whenever we did the level reviews, I was particularly like, oh no, that should be a bit bigger, this should be here. And then we had the enemies who were essentially representing the forces of repression in the main character's mind. And I had this particular obsession with them being essentially on all fours and being slightly hairy and to then chase you around this swimming pool. And the animators kept complaining to me because the way the game camera worked, if they were on all fours, it was really hard to see them. And hair as well, is, at that time at least, it was very hard to render. So everyone was like, Sam, why are you so obsessed with this thing? And then I realized that when I was 5, I was living in Tanzania, and there was an incident where I was chased around a swimming pool by a pack of baboons whilst the adults who were in attendance laughed. Well, that's my memory of it, at least. So this was like a majorly traumatic moment in my childhood that I tucked away and was attempting to kind of recreate as, and that was a game about, so the whole game, ostensibly, it apparently on the surface is a story about a father who is looking for his lost daughter. And at the end, you realize it's actually from the perspective of the daughter who lost her father when she was very young. So kind of repeatedly throughout the thing, you have the trauma of this child that has lost a parental figure. And so obviously I was tapping into me as a 5-year-old in a kind of similar circumstance. Yeah, no, I mean, for my games where I'm always trying to communicate a very precise emotion in each of the games. There's usually like a thematic question as well that I'm trying to tackle, and I'm like mostly I repeatedly am interested in like identity, the extent to which we have an internal version of ourselves and how we externalize that, how that manifests in our relationships and things. So I'll always, as a writer, you're always trying, all you can really lean on is your own personal experience, right? So I will have, as my kind of check, there's this emotion that if you try and put it into words, it'll sound trite, right? So the game Telling Lies was, how does it feel to have been in a relationship that has actually been a negative relationship, and yet you still have memories of like the honeymoon period of the relationship that were joyful, and your brain is capable of holding that joy with then the subsequent trauma of it, and that particular kind of bittersweet mush in your brain was the thing we were trying to reach for. So that to me is always how I calibrate things, is trying to draw upon that kind of personal experience, which I think is super useful.
Yeah, definitely. I find that very interesting. I actually want to stick on you for a second and ask about the psych system in Silent Hill: Shattered Memories, which is basically psychologically profiling the player through basically anything they do in the game, as well as simulated therapy sessions, if I have that correct.
Yeah, so I don't, if there's anyone here that deeply involved psychometrics, this was in 2008, and dipping our toes into the field of psychometrics, which at the time seemed to be kind of, there were various levels of quality, and there was a lot of kind of statistical manipulation. But the kind of idea going in was, we'll use like a 4 or 5 factor personality model, and there are all these publicly used tests. And what if we build into the mechanism of the game that we are doing all of these tests? And interestingly, when you're talking about kind of psychotic behavior, I think the 5 factor, the 5th factor is like psychopathy or something, which we dismissed because we discovered that people's natural behavior in a video game is often indistinguishable from psychotic behavior, right? Like if people are acting in an antisocial way or in a violent way, that's kind of what you do in a video game. So what we were doing there was, and I was partly inspired by Timothy Leary. Before his death, he created a piece of software. Like the history of video games and software in general is full of all these fascinating experiments that everyone then subsequently forgets about. Timothy Leary made this product called the Mind Mirror, which was a therapeutic tool that would allow people to kind of do interesting kind of therapeutic explorations. But the idea was, as people play the game, we will be watching what they're doing. We had essentially gaze tracking within the game, because it was a horror game where you're using a flashlight, and because you were using a Wii remote, it was actually quite a kind of intuitive, organic way of looking around. So when a player would walk into a room, because they were using a flashlight, we had a very specific cone, and we knew what they were looking at, so we could track what they were looking at, the environment, how they dealt with other characters, the way they behaved, and we created this inventory of test items. So it was things like on entering the forest level, do they walk down the path or do they step off the path into the undergrowth? When they enter this room, which has 5 closets in it, do they check through every closet before proceeding? We would do tricks like the player would know they had to get a key from a mannequin, and they'd walk into the room and there'd be 3 mannequins. The first mannequin they unzipped would have the key on it. Do they then just proceed, or do they then continue to check the others? And we did a bunch of testing to kind of ratify that these things mapped somewhat usefully. And then kind of the opposite of what we've been talking about possibly was, rather than use it in a therapeutic way, we then tried to use the profile we had of the player to actually make them anxious or upset them. And again, this was using a lot of kind of very broad psychometrics. So for example, you're looking for your lost daughter, there's a single building in a street with a light on, you go into it, there is a police officer there. For people whose expectation of authority figures was such that if an authority figure acted in a way that was immoral or bad, that would make them more anxious. We gave them this kind of shitty cop that accused them of being drunk and was very mean to them. And so we were kind of we were using it very much as dramatists of like, how do we juice this particular scene? But it was all towards making you feel seen, making you feel more involved, so that at the very end, when we kind of revealed what was really going on, you had this real sense of personal attachment to this character you created.
Yeah, and I think I'm just gonna say very briefly, like, I think that personal attachment is at the core of what will help people going forward, like, learn about mental health through games. I think it is, that empathy, whether it is with the characters or even with themselves, through the eyes of somebody who's dealing with mental illness. Like, that's what it's all about. Now, Manoj, I know you need to head out soon, but there is one question I really want to get to ask you, and you're coming from a very unique position on this panel, that you're coming from academia. So, how do you see, games specifically, about mental illness? How could you see them used to teach about mental illness within the classroom or within academic settings? Anything you have to say about that?
I wanted to ask, did that game come with trigger warnings?
Yes.
Well, you're telling me this.
Well, so back then we didn't do trigger warnings in 2009, but it explicitly had a warning at the start that was meant to look like a health warning to
I'm just kidding. As you were talking, creating a. I think that. So when I went to grad school to study, you learn to do therapy with people in person, right? One-on-one, and sometimes you were in a room with like a one-sided mirror and somebody was on the other side, sort of like Law and Order, checking on what you're doing and correcting you if you're wrong, kind of disconcerting, but that's how you learn, right? And then over the years, we went from that to virtual therapy, right? Especially during the pandemic, it was virtual. And then from there, we've gone to like chatting therapy that's by chat on a phone, because some people feel safer that way or feel that that might be the best way to at least gain an entree. And to me, from working in the field, any which way a person can get help or seek help is like a win-win, right? So whether some people prefer the face-to-face, some people prefer a game, some people prefer a chat. So I think that it just increases sort of access, and I think that's really critical. I think teaching about it is really critical in two ways. One is for people who are going to work in mental health, it helps them get better in how do you reach out to the broadest population, right? I think earlier you were talking about younger generation, and I'm thinking, yeah, but I know 40-year-olds who play games, right? Like, so I'm like,
yeah, they started out with like,
I mean, you talked about dementia. There was the thing in Japan, they had to put out a larger model of the DS handheld, because so many of the aging population in Japan wanted a DS to play brain training.
That's
they
right.
wanted to,
yeah, that's what they use it for.
So they had to create a big one.
It's across the board. So I think that it's more about how can we make this more accessible to everybody? And I think for people who are into gaming or developing games, it's sort of trying to understand. The only thing that I sometimes worry about is what is the expertise and knowledge that gamers have when they're developing these games, right? Are they getting the most updated, the best practice information? Because one can do more harm than good, right? Even with good intentions. So that's always, but I think any which way we can increase awareness and knowledge through games is really critical. So people that are going into gaming or technology, love it. For people who are actually working in the field, I think it's just a way, like in medicine, they use simulation, right? You can't always see every client you want, and you learn how to work with people. And I think games just helps you understand, like I said, the internal experience of people, but also how do you approach, like you talked earlier about what does New York City look like on a busy day? You can explain it to me and I have a sense, but if I play the game or watch the video, it's really like, whoa, I never thought, like, this never occurred to me, that never occurred to me. So I think it just is eye-opening, and it just makes you a better helper, whether it's a therapist or a caregiver or supporter.
Yeah, great. And again, I know you have to head out of here, but thank you so much for showing up today and for fantastic insight.
Thank you.
So everybody,
Thank you very much. No,
Manoj.
thank you. Sorry.
Okay. Sarah, I'm going to jump back to you in a second, but Sam, Manoj was talking about how, we need to be getting insight from the right people. So when you were working either on Silent Hill Shattered Memories, or I know Her Story and Telling Lies do have aspects of mental health and I think immortality as well, were you consulting with anybody on these topics when developing these games to make sure that there's an accuracy to what you're portraying?
Yeah, and it's definitely changed over the years. So again, when we were making Shattered Memories, the very idea that we would be taking our theme seriously was in itself seen as something special. But we consulted with a therapist. We spoke to some academics who were doing some of the kind of gaze-based psychometric work. And then everything else really was on me, reading a lot of material about complicated grief, reading lots of testimonies. It was really hard back then, actually. I think now, when I do stuff now, I tend to put more effort into research, and because it's kind of film adjacent, people get it. Back then, and I have friends that had similar stories, if you were to approach someone and say, I'd love to talk to you about the process of your grief because I'm making this video game, people would have felt like this was very exploitative, like a video game is not the right place to be discussing this. So a lot of the work on Shattered Memories was reading testimonies that already existed or in other people's work. But subsequently, we will reach out to people and kind of have useful interviews with them or kind of bring people in and on a kind of consulting basis.
Yeah, that's really important. I remember reading an article that for Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice, there was also a lot of issues they had. Although, I'm going to be honest, I'm blanking exactly on what the issues are. I'm not sure if either of you can speak to that. We don't have to right now. But Sarah, I actually want to get to another angle at this that I think you have a lot of perspective on. You wrote an article about how Control and the character of Jesse Faden was really eye-opening for you because it's a character that the developers coded, whether they meant to or not, with our autistic language. It never, specifically said was autistic, yet you were really able to see yourself in this character, and you were able to see something that you hadn't seen in a game before. So I'm curious to hear about your experience with that.
Sure thing. So the main character of Control is this woman, Jesse Faden, who I had seen reviews describe her as coming across as a little bit odd. She is very guarded with her emotions. The dialogue in this game takes much longer than you would think it ought to, because basically every one of her statements is prefaced by her thinking about what she should say, and then followed up by her thinking about either, oh, I shouldn't have said that, or I wonder how this is going to be interpreted. And I mean, that was just one of kind of many features of this character, but the more that I played Control, the more I thought, essentially, wow, I don't know that the game developers intended this, but I absolutely read Jesse Faden as an autistic woman. This is how I would want an explicitly autistic character to be portrayed in some subsequent game. Because it wasn't, it wasn't Jesse Faden versus the autism demon. It wasn't kind of trivializing it like that. But she was allowed to essentially just exist as this character with these struggles that I read as being sort of inherent to being autistic. And still, that wasn't necessarily the main focus of the game. The main focus of the game was in fighting the eldritch horror that is currently occupying the office building that she's in. But it was still allowed to deeply influence her as a character. Yeah.
Yeah, and I remember a comment you made very specifically that you actually preferred, and maybe I'm misremembering this, but you preferred that Jesse Faden almost was not explicitly said to be autistic. Why did you feel that way?
So I guess I feel that way for Jesse Faden in Control because if we do go with the theory that she is autistic, that is not central to the game's plot. It's not necessarily information that's super relevant to the plot. It can certainly inform an understanding of the character, but if it were to come up explicitly in that game, it's kind of hard to think of a way that it would that wouldn't have felt somewhat forced or somewhat arbitrary. A similar case, actually, I think, is the character Symmetra from Overwatch, who is one of very few, if not one of the only, explicitly autistic characters in kind of a big game that I can think of. And I do actually really appreciate how Activision Blizzard handled that revelation, which was that they kind of just didn't mention it for a while, and a lot of players, playing this character were asking, like, hey, is she autistic? Because, like, some of these behaviors, they maybe think that she is. And then Activision Blizzard's response was essentially, yes, she is. Any other questions? Like, they handled it in such a nonchalant way, which I thought was really excellent. It wasn't the entirety of her character, but it was absolutely that informed her character.
Yeah, definitely. Sam, I'm just going to kind of let you bounce off that, if at all. Either with yourself or with anybody, anecdotes you may have with people who have played your games, be it Silent Hill or any of the more recent games that you've made independently. Have you had people come up to you and say that they were able to see themselves through your games? Ideally through mental health, but even otherwise.
Yeah, I guess the most moving stuff was on Silent Hill because it specifically dealt with this particularly deep form of grief. So, and as well, that was like 2009, so there wasn't as much internet around. So we would actually get letters that would come from people about how they had, especially around like the loss of a parent, there were people who were estranged from their surviving parent. There were people that had trouble coming to terms with grief, that had, through playing this game, actually had a moment and being able to process things and reach out. There was I remember there was a mother who had lost a child that reached out to say how much it helped them. So, I think those are the ones where you're like, okay, that was worth it for that one person.
Yeah, and I honestly find this super interesting because to me, I see kind of a depression question as almost like a starting line for a lot of what's come after, but we're really talking about a game, as you've consistently said, that's come before that period. So yeah, I think it kind of just goes to show that this is something that has existed, but in a very nascent form, still in a very nascent form. And kind of to that end, I think, Nicole, how are we doing on time? 6:56. Okay. So before we head into the Q&A, I want to give you both a chance to just, if there's anything I haven't brought up that you wanted to mention, now is the best time to do that. So, so Sarah, let's go with you.
I'm honestly having trouble thinking of anything in particular. But,
well, maybe one thing that I know I didn't get to with you was the idea of headcanoning. We kind of hit on it, but if you want to expand a little bit more.
Sure. So, kind of in case anybody in the audience is unfamiliar with the term, headcanoning is basically looking at fictional characters or whatever and deciding for yourself to some degree, this character is blank. So in my case, it's my headcanon that Jesse Faden from Control is autistic. It's not confirmed by the creators at all, but I have, for my own reading of this game, essentially just declared it as fact for my own personal interpretation. And you see this a lot, not just with kind of mental health, but also there are plenty of characters that various fans of a show or of a movie or whatever will say like, oh, that person is queer. That person is, is trans or is gay or deals with this. Or even just something like, you know what, I bet that character's favorite food is macaroni and cheese. Like, it can be something kind of as small as that. But it is very often a way for people of sort of marginalized identities to kind of put representation into media that doesn't necessarily have it. Control is not a game that has any explicitly autistic characters, but I can see myself in Jesse Faden, and so I just decide this is a game about an autistic woman going through this situation. And it's a way for me to kind of put that representation into that game.
Yeah, fantastic. I completely agree. And I think it just kind of, I noticed Celeste earlier, and I know the creator who came out as trans after the game had already come out said that she actually realized the making of that game, while it is about depression, is also a reflection of her experience, going through that transition. So I find maybe this is slightly different than headcanoning, I guess, but it almost like makes you think maybe people who are making these games, when coding them in these ways, by coding I mean like socially coding, are maybe there's something to that. I don't know.
Definitely. I mean, it's something that I've seen talked about with. There are plenty of TV shows where there are characters who have a number of autistic traits, but who are never outright stated to be autistic. And the consensus that I've seen from kind of various people talking about these things mostly online is that those writers who are behind those characters probably have a really good autistic friend that they are basing this character on, and maybe they don't know that that person is autistic, but like that's where they're getting some of these traits from.
Yeah, absolutely. And Sam, not to just throw you into the deep end, I guess, like I did before, but with Sarah. But I guess one question I didn't get to with you about the psych system that we've talked about in Silent Hill Shattered Memories is that, at the time you had to go in and code all of these little interactions. Obviously, we've continuously hit on upon this is a 2009 game, and technology has expanded a lot since then. So do you think, looking at the landscape now of what can be done with games, perhaps with AI, but other things as well, how that can potentially impact the way we approach creating systems like this?
So I'm going to pounce on you saying AI. And
it's like a very tricky thing to get around, but it's just the buzzword. I gotta say.
I think for me, and this is just me particularly, but because I always come at these from the perspective of being a writer and then working with the actors, or whatever. For me, the technology is a means to create like an interesting dialogue, and I think like with the tech we had on Shattered Memories, it was about like what feedback can we get from the player? How can they express themselves in a way that is useful, so that I can then react and create something? And I think with all the subsequent games, and I think what makes something like Immortality very different to most narrative games is that the player's role is not to navigate some kind of simple choice diagram or something, but is to express themselves. And there's such a rich range of expression within the game that they're actually saying something quite unique and meaningful, which is useful to me to then create an experience that can do something with that, but it's also useful to them because it creates and kind of promotes a level of intimacy with the experience, which I think is, and when you talk about character interiority and you talk about mental health, like I think there's a barrier to overcome in that, you can go and watch a 90-minute movie, and when we're trying to figure out like why would gaming possibly be a more useful way of doing these things, you can go and see a 90-minute movie and the movie is doing everything it can to immerse you in the character's world, and have you lean in, but there is this frame, there is kind of distance between you. And I think what's really exciting about video games is the degree of your involvement, and all of my games, and Immortality in particular, are about finding ways to have you lean in even closer, become obsessive about the thing, pay so much attention that you come to know these characters, and you're building like a mental model of these characters to the extent that they feel, you feel like you know them more, you feel like you've lived alongside them more. So I think that, for me, like, what can the technology bring is find ways to increase that fidelity of dialogue between me and the player. But there's still, for me, like having a human be on both ends of this experience, right? I think the technology is the thing in between, but it's still about two people.
Yeah, definitely. And I think what's also very interesting when I've played your games, I think every player is going to have a very different experience. And I know when researching for this that I was like, okay, how is mental illness shown in her story and Telling Lies and Immortality? And I found really good examples, but I was like, wow, I don't remember really coming across those specific things. So it's like, it's just a very interesting dynamic specifically of the games you make. Anyway, at this point, I think we're going to open up to Q&A. We are going to take, again, both online questions and in-person questions. Anybody who wants to ask a question in person, just raise your hand and I will come out to you. And we will work out the online questions. Cool. Okay. Okay. Anyway, so anybody?
Hi, thank you. So question for both of you. So video games obviously are this incredibly immersive form of media. They really allow you to interact with a story and with a narrative and with characters in a way that you can't in any other form. Especially when you're looking at video games as a tool for building empathy between the player and the character that they're inhabiting, between them and the other characters you're interacting with, and then thinking about that as building empathy for mental health and kind of around issues of mental health. How do you balance the need or the goal of education and the desire also to be entertaining and compelling in your narrative?
Sure. Either of you want to take that? I mean,
Go first.
All right. So for my games, I think I've often leaned far more into the sort of educational and I've leaned far more into the idea of these games being educational than I have into the idea of these games being, at the very least, fun, per se. Though I do still want the games that I make to be good games. I don't necessarily think that fun has to be the primary emotion of every game, and that particularly for certain kind of educational contexts, maybe it shouldn't be. But that doesn't mean that there can't be humor or fun in these games. For my game Morning Ritual, which is all about, kind of how complicated and difficult certain tasks can feel to do sometimes, the basic gameplay of it involves trying to complete some sort of vague ritual that requires the player to decode a piece of complex cryptography and interpret tarot cards and alchemical symbols and search through all of these books that are on the desk to, figure out how to do any of this. And you go through all of this, and then the punchline, and I am using that word for a reason, is that what this results in is that you brush your teeth. There is an element of humor with that. And I always knew with designing that game that I wanted there to be that kind of punchline humorous moment. But the minute-to-minute gameplay, I wanted to be interesting and engaging, though I don't know that fun was precisely the adjective that I was going for with it. I think that you can make very fun educational games. As somebody who grew up in the 90s with a lot of edutainment games that I greatly enjoyed, I can attest to that. So I do think it's kind of a case-by-case basis.
Yeah, and Sam, I mean, Silent Hill obviously is a AAA franchise, so there are people with money looking to make a fun game, you know? How did you balance that with the psychological profiling system, which some users may not have found fun?
I mean, I think in that case, I was very naughty because everything we did in that game, we got past people. So we were, you know, and there were layers of chaos within the management at Konami at that time. So that was less of a pressure. I think it's interesting that you talk about empathy, because it almost feels like that's been the cliche of educational games or serious games, has been this idea that, oh, if we stick you in a video game, it's an empathy machine. And especially VR was like, that was the hype pitch for VR. And I think, you know, traditional media are also very good at empathy, right? You go watch a movie, you'll end up in tears. If it's, you know, watch a Pixar movie, I'll be in floods of tears.
I was just gonna say, like, emotional manipulation is like the art of film storytelling. So, yeah.
And I think sometimes actually in video games, there is distance created by the act of interacting, by the distance between what the game allows you to do, and so actually you get these different kind of interesting challenges. And I think like the thing that I found interesting is, like, if you watch a movie, so if you go to see a movie, trying to think of an obvious one, I don't know, you're going to see A Beautiful Mind, right? You know from the poster and the pitch, this is going to be dealing with this character's mental health, and it's a serious drama, so you know what you're into for 90 minutes. And I think one of the interesting aspects of video games and digital media in general is their unbounded nature. So if you sit down to play Immortality, and we mentioned trigger warnings earlier, like there is a very exhaustive trigger warning at the start of Immortality, because by its nature, you can kind of wander into stuff that will catch you by surprise. And there's, you know, people have played it for 20 plus hours, getting in the weeds. So you can go in the way that like a 90-minute movie, you have the safety of knowing that you're going to creep up on these things, and there's a structure to it, and it's kind of a movie. It can be challenging, but also interesting to make something, you know, and I've had some of the more interesting feedback we had when we were testing Immortality was the extent to which the enjoyment would be people's kind of curiosity or their vicarious enjoyment of having a window into what was going on, and the kind of the more kind of soap opera elements of the behind the scenes of a movie set, which is the setting of Immortality. And then they would make a couple of choices that would lead them into something much more kind of traumatic, and suddenly they would feel a sense of like guilt and complicity in some of that, you know, I think you would sometimes get in, you know, someone like Hitchcock very much engineers the audience's complicity to create certain anxiety and emotions and stuff. But, you know, it's definitely a very interesting aspect.
Yeah, so I'm gonna go off topic a little bit here because Immortality is so interesting to me. So Immortality to me is like a director relinquishing their ability to very carefully craft the journey you go on. The journey each person takes is going to be very different, and as I have shown Immortality to other people, I'm playing it, I'm like, oh, well, the specific mechanic in the game that, you know, you usually find out about a few hours and usually figure it out, I already know, so I'm just doing it. But I also see like a very different experience every time, yet it still hits the same beats. So if you could just very quickly talk about how Immortality like makes sure to hits all those beats, to make sure the player is getting all the important information, even if they're getting it in very different orders.
I mean, it's mostly the player's job. So if you haven't played Immortality, it's a game in which there is hours and hours of footage from an unfinished from 3 unfinished movies that never came out from the 60s, 70s, and 90s. And you're looking through it to figure out what happened to the actress that stars in all 3 movies. The mechanic you do this is, as you're watching a piece of footage, you can at any point stop it, and you can kind of rewind and enjoy the tactile kind of feel of watching the film. And you can point to any image on screen, and the game will then generate for you a match cut between that thing, be that your face, a dagger, some flowers in the background, to another scene in which you appear, or a dagger appears, or a flower appears. So as the player, you have some intentionality, right? Like, oh, I'm really interested in this character, Carl. Show me more Carl. Or clearly there's this repeated imagery of a dagger. I want to dig into that. Show me more of that. It's probably going to be dramatic and exciting if there's a dagger in the scene, right? Yeah. So you have that ability to express what you think is interesting. But then there is some randomness to it, essentially. And there's like a big algorithm that decides what scene you should go to next. But the main thing is that the way the story is presented, it has layers to it that starts at the surface, and then there is the story of what's really going on, and then there's the story of what's really, really going on. And the key thing is, like, the audience, the modern audience, is so sophisticated when it comes to storytelling, has seen so much story, knows all the tropes, has absorbed so much, that they're very sophisticated at putting these pieces together. And so as they go, they'll see a scene, and then they'll see another scene, and this will unlock some understanding of this other scene. And then their ability to be like, oh shit, I figured out what's going on between Carl and Marissa. Then they go click on some more Carl to kind of confirm their suspicions or whatever, right? Like, so there's, and what gets really interesting is there is then a pacing that emerges that is the player's choice. Because yeah, if you're making a 90-minute movie, you have to be very careful about engineering a very specific pacing to keep the audience's interest. But here, like, if someone's at home and they might play for 5-6 hours, right? And if they're getting to the point where they want something exciting to happen, there is a way of them saying, well, I know that there's this thing I haven't watched, or I know that if I click on this character, that's going to get me back to the meat of the story. And so they can kind of steer loosely the story back to something more exciting. Or if actually they're feeling like they're very chill and they've got all the time in the world, they can go down these little rabbit holes. So there's this sense of you can lean into the audience steering the thing.
Yeah, and actually just to take what you were talking about and apply it to mental health perspective, like the idea that people are so used to film, so used to playing games, creates a basis for us to build upon to add elements about mental illness, because we don't have to teach them what a game is, what these mechanics are. We can do something like what the game Amori does, which flips the mechanics on its head. Basically, it takes an RPG battle system and reframes it as emotions. You know, all these status effects are emotions, and that plays into the narrative in a lot of different really interesting ways. So yeah, so I think that what you're talking about, you know, obviously I asked a question that is a little off topic, but I do think it comes back to that. Anyway, okay, great. Does anybody else have a question here?
Hello there. Thank you so much for this panel. It's been great. What I am particularly interested in is this subject, which, you know, I think we've touched on it, you know, a little bit, or really considerably, actually, come to think of it. I'm very interested in the subject of video games, or film really, as catharsis. Now, for example, at the onset of the pandemic, there was an increase in people who were consuming post-apocalyptic media, right? And there has been considerable research before that, but certainly at the time there was this increased interest that prompted all these news articles, et cetera. And people were talking about how this helped people make sense of the new reality, if you will. So I'd be very interested in your thoughts about that, about how perhaps it has helped you. You know, I can definitely tell you, as someone who grew up in the, you know, also in the 1990s, my first loves were absolutely Chrono Trigger, Pokemon, and Final Fantasy 7 and 10, and it was fabulous. And it taught me how to be, you know, like more of a critical thinker. You have to figure out how to solve these games, right? And that can be very empowering in lots of ways, especially how being, you know, within a game helps you sort of escape the reality, if you will. I think that it can make people feel very powerful. Would you like to elaborate on that?
Yeah, I mean, catharsis that's my baby, really. Like, that's if people are like, well, what are you going to have if you're not going to have fun? For me, catharsis of recognition of something or of being able to re-examine something in a safer place and through fiction. And that's always, for me, the ending is always kind of the starting point of like, where do we want to get people? What does that catharsis feel like? What is that moment that they're kind of going to be living through again and pushing out to? And sometimes sometimes it can be complicated. I know that I think this is somewhat relevant. So Telling Lies was a game inspired by some horrific things that the police did in the UK. And it was an attempt to create a narrative about undercover policing that actually centered on these three women who were the victims of this undercover policing rather than the cop hero. And there was a lot of trying to figure out like how in the ending to not just have it be miserable and to actually find a way of finding some kind of catharsis and see these characters live beyond and focus on the fact that the real women who had lived through these things were, had survived. And I think, for me, I know like the screenwriting guru, Robert McKee, who has his own issues, but like he talks about the role for him of storytelling is this combination of idea and emotion, which in real life we don't experience simultaneously, right? If I walk down the street and I see someone run over by a car, in the moment it's all the emotion and the horror and the shock. And then maybe 2 weeks later, I think about it in the context of my own mortality, and it becomes a way of me thinking about that. Whereas in art, the distance that you have in art, as well as that incredible immersion, allows you to kind of have those simultaneously, which is essentially what catharsis is to me. And it used to be that was what we went to religion for. That was the religious moment, the religious thing of looking at art or singing songs, whatever. So that to me is a very useful tool, and I think the sense of intimacy that I try and promote in my games, I think can make that be much more powerful.
So, anyone else? And if we can, we're running low on time, so if we can start.
Okay, yeah, sure thing. Hello. So I just have a bit of a general question, actually. I know we discussed a lot today. Sam, you brought up how core memories influence like your design elements with previous games as well as current projects. Sarah, I know that you brought up autobiographical games and how that kind of builds up your own influences now. But I did also just want to ask, for developers interested in underscoring any mental health statuses that they deal with like now or just over the course of their life, what would you say might be a good first step to take when designing their own experiences?
So for my part, like when designing my kind of autobiographical games, I look for small things that I can somewhat easily turn into game mechanics. The conversation checklist was a perfect thing for a sort of Five Nights at Freddy's style complicated management game. There was a lot about the experience of walking down a busy New York City street and kind of how overwhelming that experience can feel that I could very easily turn into the obstacles in a roguelike. But all of these games are about very small-scale, isolated experiences, and I think that that's probably a good starting point. It's much easier to take this small thing and figure out how to make a game around that than it is to say, I want to make a game about being autistic, period. There's a lot there that could be covered, and not all of it will probably fit into one game.
Yeah, I think, obviously I have the advantage of mostly making independent games now, so you can kind of scope them in whatever way you want, but I think your autobiographical games seems like you have a similar thing in that I will always focus on like a central metaphor that for me is, I don't know if metaphor is probably stretching it, becomes the mechanic and it becomes the audience's way in. So like when you tell me, oh, I've made a game about how difficult it is to navigate New York on a busy day, as an autistic person, instantly I'm like, okay, I know what this is going to be and I know the constraints. And so for me, even with my games, like Her Story, I knew it was possibly going to work because the whole game was built around this metaphor of that moment in a police show where someone's going through the police database trying to find one more clue, or it's a series of microfiche newspapers or whatever. And it was like, oh, that is this incredible metaphor that will allow me to tell this story about digging into this woman's life. And once I've executed on it, I can show people 5 minutes of the game and they'll get, oh, I know what I'm doing, what the constraints are, the kind of experience, and then, you know, then you've got them in and you can go wherever you want. So I think for me, it's always, I mean, I have a checklist of 3 things. It's like, what is the theme? What is the emotion, the specific emotion? And then what is the metaphor that is going to underpin that? And those all have to kind of make sense together. But I think having that understanding of the mechanism, I think, is super important in a game.
Awesome. So we probably have time for 2 more quick questions. So here, let me
certain mental illnesses, they lend themselves better for certain types of games. Like, for example, like with psychosis and like horror games. But other mental illnesses may not, and mental illnesses aren't always fun. So like just recreating them probably wouldn't be a fun game. What kind of advice would you have on like representing that in a video game with those constraints? Like, would it just be a part of the narrative? Should we still try to implement it somehow without? Yeah, just if you could talk on that.
So I do think that you bring up this point that certain mental illnesses are sort of better suited to certain kinds of games. I think that psychosis in horror games is kind of a common trope. I don't actually think, though, that horror games are the only place where even something like psychosis could be applied. And I would
also possibly been problematic.
No, exactly.
Past,
I was about to say, yeah, like it's also, I would also argue that, the prevalence of psychosis in horror games is itself an issue that I don't know we quite have time to sort of go deeply into. I would absolutely love to see like a fun, like lighthearted game about psychosis, made by somebody who experiences that. I think that would be genuinely interesting. So I guess my advice is that, it may kind of seem like these things wouldn't work, but anytime that I hear that, I'm like, well, why not? Like, why can't we try? At best case, it will work spectacularly, and at worst, it will be a very interesting failure, which are often also really fun in their own way.
Yeah, I mean, I think I crave specificity, and I'm like, I want to see specific stories. And I think, not to jump to movies again, but like, not every movie is fun, right? And there are certain movies where you're not going to have a fun time, but there's still a hook. There's still a reason I want to go and see it, right? It might be because this sounds just interesting. Like, as human beings, we are naturally interested in other human beings. It might be that there's something I relate to that I think is going to be interesting in it. So I think if you understand what that hook is, like, the pitch is not come and have fun experiencing this POV. It's like, but there should be some way in, I think, for the audience.
Great. And anybody with one last question? And was there? I saw one more hand up before, so I don't know if you're still in. Okay.
Thank you. Kind of forgot it, but I'll make one that's adjacent to what I think it was, which is this rolls back about to 1.5 questions. I really enjoyed the way you both talked about essentially your processes. It seems to me that they are different but similar in that you do take a specific approach with, as you said, small scale, and thus from that what can turn into essentially a game, while you focus more on, in essence, concept. And concept's not really the right word for it, but you get it because I'm kind of speeding up. And then from there, the constraints and then building something around it. But have either of you put much thought into, or is it a part of the process, what the ending might be like? Especially since games are, as you said, Sam, unbound, unlike a film wherein you generally would expect beginning, middle, end.
No, as I say, that's an interesting one. So with Morning Ritual, the idea came from having this sort of punchline in mind of going through this whole complicated process, and then the end result is something as mundane as you brush your teeth. You know, that I knew what the ending of that would be right from the start. And in some ways, the design process of that was, how convoluted can I make this ritual before it just becomes annoying, like before it's no longer intriguing? But on the other hand, there are definitely other games where, yeah, what is the end point of this is a much more difficult question. You know, does it just end? Is it once you hit a certain score that this happens? In the case of ASD, it's that your character makes it to school. And, you know, in kind of the movie of this, that is not where the story would end, but for the game it is. I think that for me, because I am taking such small-scale things and turning them into games, it's somewhat easier for me to kind of find where the end point is, because it is such a small-scale conflict, I suppose. You know, where it's, okay, you have this goal, walk this number of blocks to get to school, or get through this conversation, or brush your teeth. You know, it's a very specific goal, and so I kind of know what that is. But I've also been making, you know, very small-scale games, and I haven't yet really had the experience of making a much larger game to where, you know, that sort of ending point might be a little bit more nuanced or difficult.
Yeah, I think I've come at this from both ends. So Shattered Memories was a game where we had a very specific cathartic endpoint where you're going to see the young woman essentially destroy or let die this version of her father that the player had created. So it was this cathartic letting go. And everything we did was to get you to that point, to the point of like a lot of the traditional frustrations or challenges or bottlenecks of a video game we didn't have, because we wanted people to, you know, like 20% of people finish most video games. And we were like, well, this game doesn't make sense if you don't get to the end. With the more recent games, we've had a different problem where they're so unbounded. And like starting out, the question was like, well, how does someone know they're finished looking at a sculpture, right? There is no, they decide and they walk away. And with each of the video games, or the video games I've made, we've had to find ways to give you that choice. Because when looking into it, people didn't want to get patted on the back and be told you've won, well done. They wanted permission to leave, because they might feel like they've had that moment. They might feel like they've had that full meal, but they didn't want to walk away if there was something they'd missed, right? Or especially where there are these mysteries and questions. So we found different ways, and there is lots of stuff in the games that tracks how much you've seen and what things you've seen, and is this a good point to kick you out and give you this kind of and literally in her story, it asks you, are you ready to, something like, are you ready to leave now, within the fiction of the story. There was actually a very, very popular meme where somebody on Steam asked, how does this game end? And somebody said, oh, the game's over when you're satisfied. And then they said, how will I know when I'm satisfied? And everyone screenshotted that, and it became the defining feature of all my games now. But you know, it was a good question, and the game does have a concept of when you should be satisfied. But yeah, it definitely becomes interesting, and you're always fighting against the concept, because even like I'm making these weird games, I still have to put achievements in them, right? Because so with Immortality, there's an achievement for having seen every single piece of video footage in the thing, and so then people come to me and they're like, oh man, it took me like 5 hours to find that last piece of footage. And I'm like, you weren't supposed to do that. And they were like, but there was an achievement for it. Because if I didn't have the achievement, there would then be people that found every single piece of footage and then were like, where the hell's my achievement? So there's still, like, you're still wrestling with the platforms and the formats. And because I love the idea with these games that they don't have to ever be finished. in the same way, some of my favorite movies, favorite books, I don't feel like I'm finished with them. I put them on the shelf, but I might rewatch them or take them down again. And I love the idea that because my games are explicitly unbounded, you can put them on the shelf knowing that, oh, if I have a rainy day, I can come back and poke around and discover some more things, see stuff I've never seen before, right? In the same way that people might go and look at their favorite painting or something.
All right, everybody. So Sarah Doherty Granoff, Sam Barlow, thank you so much for coming out. So before we close, this was something I was actually going to do at the start, but because Manoj had to leave early, I wanted to make sure we got as much time in with him as possible. But I just want to give some thanks to the people who have made all of this possible. That first of all, my collaborators on this, Nicole Papadopoulos and Kevin Hoskin, have enabled me and believed in me and has brought me to this point. So I have no words to express the thanks, and I'm very excited for the work we're gonna be continuing to do. Yeah, thanks. And as I said, we have a couple cameras here. I want to thank our camera operators, Priska Edwards and Roger Matthews. I want to thank the people who have really platformed me here, which is the Mellon Public Humanities Program. Leadership includes Linda Alkoff, Nico Israel, Jonathan Fanton, Ashley Fenstermaker, and Jay Jeremiah Perez-Torres. So thank you, and thank you for coming, by the way. And of course, also in this whole process, the Office of the Provost has been extreme help. So Manoj, of course, and also Bianca Valle. I hope I said her name correctly there. But both of them have been extreme help in organizing a lot of this and making a lot of this happen. And then, of course, I feel like I got way down this list before mentioning this person, but Professor Ricardo Miranda, my mentor through this program, over the last year, as I've really studied this more academically, he's been kind of the backbone for that. He's really kept me on my toes, kept me on my feet, and put me in the right direction, so thank you so much. And has also been instrumental in helping me with this. And before everybody, I'll clap first. And lastly, but definitely not least, the Hunter team that has made this event possible. That includes David Pavlovsky, Shasha Fang, Maya Anderson, Peter Jackson, and okay, he wrote down how to pronounce his name here. I'm going to do my best. Edenis Bakaj. I think I got it right. Anyway, okay, and everybody else who's just been supportive of me throughout this entire process. And thank you to my dad for flying out here for this. So anyway, that's really all. I'll just end on saying we will be having a networking event at a bar called the Huntarian. It's at 413 East 70th Street. So I believe that is 70th between 1st and 2nd. So it's about a half-mile walk from here, but if you can make it, we'd love to have you, and I will be there as soon as possible once we've cleaned everything up. So anyway, thank you, everybody, and thanks to our panelists again.